treating us to our next presentation, which is entitled Passing Through the American Vortex, Allen Ginsberg's Observational Auto-Poesy and the Fall of America. Michael?
Hi, everyone, and my deep apologies for the mix-up. I made the entirely human error of getting the East Coast and West Coast times mixed up. So for any of you on the West Coast, I'm sure it's happened before. Can you all see the slides okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here today. My name is Mike Breger, and the title of my talk today is Passing Through the American Vortex, Allen Ginsberg's Observational Auto-Poesy and the Fall of America, 1965 through 1972. And this topic is also the topic of my MLA thesis, which I finished up last year. So this is just a small snippet of the total work. The focus of my talk today is not on Ginsberg's earlier poetry, but it's on the middle period of his career, which is summed up in the volume The Fall of America, in which Ginsberg is exploring and he's exploring the United States, he's exploring the relationship between poetry, politics, and the burgeoning field of eco-poetics. And I look at Ginsberg's experimentation with a new way of facilitating his notion of auto-poesy, what he viewed as a direct and unmediated expression of thought and inspiration in words during pretty turbulent years of crisis and contention in American history. And my research addresses Ginsberg's poetic philosophy and methods of poetic composition and the impact of technology upon it. First, who was Allen Ginsberg? He was a beat poet. Ginsberg's the most commonly understood as the founding father of the beat generation, along with Jack Kerouac and William Burroughs, who met each other at Columbia in the 1940s. It was here at Columbia where Ginsberg experienced an auditory hallucination of William Blake's poetry read by the voice of the Ancient of Days. Ginsberg believed that he had witnessed the interconnectedness of the universe. Looking out from his fire escape, Ginsberg stated that he saw not that some hand had placed the sky, but that the sky was the living blue itself, or that God was in front of my eyes and existence itself was God. And it was a sudden awakening to a deeper, real universe than I'd been existing in. This visionary prophetic voice informed Ginsberg's early works in order to harness his now heightened awareness of an interconnected reality. Ginsberg would have to generate his own poetics, a theory, a practice, a technique, and he did. On October 7th, 1955, Ginsberg performed Howl in public for the first time at a poetry reading at Six Gallery in San Francisco, along with other poets, including Gary Snyder, Philip Whalen, and Michael McClure. This night was the big bang of Allen Ginsberg's literary career, immortalized in Kerouac's novel, The Dharma Bums, describing how money was collected from audience members to buy jugs of wine that were passed around. 2 years later, the book Howl and Other Poems was at the center of an obscenity trial due to its depiction of illicit drugs and homosexual acts. As the book's opponents attacked its moral value, the defense assembled a team of eloquent witnesses, writers and poets who would speak to its literary worth. With support from the ACLU City Lights Books publisher, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, pictured here in the bottom right, won the case as the California State Superior Court ruled that the poem was of significant social importance. This notoriety established Ginsberg as an incendiary figure and one of the nation's up-and-coming popular poets. And then in the coming years, Ginsberg would release more work that garnered critical acclaim, with Kaddish named after a mourner's prayer or blessing in Judaism. This poem was Ginsberg's attempt to mourn his mother, Naomi, who suffered from severe mental illness. By the end of the 1950s, Ginsberg was widely known across the United States, but he began to feel overwhelmed by his newfound fame and decided to travel. He had left New York in 1961 to escape from his duties in America as a popular poet and decided to ease his anxieties. A prolific world traveler, he decided to visit some 66 countries over the course of his life. Whether he was traveling as a member of the Merchant Marine or traveling in support of his work or simply traveling for traveling's sake, he kept extensive journals chronicling his experiences and capturing psychological, political, and poetic landscapes. He traveled to Europe, South America, North Africa. He traveled behind the Iron Curtain to Cuba, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and even the Soviet Union. In his journals, particularly his Indian journals from 1963, he began to reconsider his poetic philosophy. He pondered and ultimately rejected his visionary prophetic approach that he experienced on the balcony in 1948, stating that visions are no longer considerable as objective and external facts, but as plastic projections of the maker and his language. His dismissal of visionary consciousness as a mere illusion represents a break with his earlier poetic approach. Much of the Indian journals is dedicated to mapping out a new form of poetics which might answer his growing questions about consciousness and its representations. He wrote extensively of consciousness and its relation to the world, and contemplating his experiences abroad invoked a meditation on his central concern as a poet, a reconciliation of the materiality of writing with the embodied state of consciousness. Ginsberg felt that the act of writing was an imperfect and complex process of fusing together partial representations of consciousness and things in the world. The experience of writing was never fully able to faithfully reconstruct consciousness. And so he began to come up with a new poetic philosophy. And so he laid out a few of the precepts at a Marxist literary conference in Kolkata. And here we have on the slide some of his notes. Here we can see that his emphasis on breaking old orders invites the poet to experiment with the infinitely varied rhythms of thought. Instead of relying on visions, Ginsberg wanted to make poems that honored consciousness and perception. In 1965, Ginsberg traveled to Cuba and East Europe, visiting Czechoslovakia, Poland, and the Soviet Union. The friction he encountered in the communist bloc renewed his interest in political affairs and spurred him to produce a sustained political invective in The Fall of America. He was unceremoniously booted from Cuba. He was proclaimed King of May in Prague, only to be dethroned by the secret police. He was silenced and scrutinized in the Soviet Union. And the journals from this period reinforce his stature as a poet provocateur and a perennial disruptor. Regardless of where he was, Ginsberg did not compromise his insistence on freedom of expression for any audience, regardless of ideological affiliation. He was essentially an anarchist, as he excoriated both the governments of the United States and in East Europe. Traveling also gave Ginsberg an opportunity to hone his journaling skills. Through journaling, the novelty of the environments he passed through, the elements out of which the world is made, was broken down into component parts. And by breaking down this rush of perception, the ordinary is freshened and interrupted. As everyday scenes are deconstructed in the journal, the apprehended world is then infused with a new significance. He would fill notebook after notebook with whatever he felt like writing, whether it be detailed descriptions of his surroundings, conversations, summaries of daily life, drafts of poems, or other personal encounters. And after traveling through Europe, South America, and Asia for years, Ginsberg returned to the United States for an extended period of time, equipped with a new technique that he would employ while crisscrossing its expanse on highways and airplanes, exploring its cities and critiquing its national character. In late 1965, he encountered a nation rife with tension. As the civil rights movement was in full swing, the assassination of John F. Kennedy had just occurred, ecological problems and the escalating war in Vietnam loomed over the public consciousness. And here you can see some of the moments from that mid-1960s. Also back home, Ginsberg had risen to near legendary status in the popular eye and would come to lead crowds in mantra chanting sessions at gatherings. Ginsberg was seen as a combination of a poet, a guru, and a paterfamilias, a bridge between the Beats and the hippies, sort of an ultimate generational advisor to the New Left. And during the 1960s, Ginsberg transformed himself from an alienated beat poet to an activist poet, as he shifted the emphasis of his writing from the tortured bohemian interior to the torturing anti-bohemian state. He would direct much of his writing and public presence towards anti-war and anti-institutional efforts for the rest of his life. Refining the observational poetics that he practiced in his travel writing abroad, he set out to write a long poem of these states, The Fall of America, which would include earlier poems of his and would map the physical contours and the spiritual health of America. The new approach seemed to energize Ginsberg, who was eager to get working. Two elements facilitated his new project. The first was a Guggenheim Fellowship that allowed Ginsberg to purchase a Volkswagen camper van, which he outfitted with a bed, a desk, and refrigerator, perhaps one of the first van lifers. The second was Bob Dylan's financial support. After talking to Ginsberg at a party in San Francisco about the poet's first attempts at writing poetry in the VW, driving back from Vancouver with poet Gary Snyder, Dylan agreed to give Ginsberg $600 to purchase an Uher reel-to-reel tape recorder. The Uher was a state-of-the-art device and could run on batteries for 10 hours, then be recharged by plugging it into a wall outlet. Ginsberg would use the device to capture his observations and reflections of consciousness in real time. And equipped with the device, Ginsberg had found a solution to the limitation of writing by hand or a typewriter. And he used the new technology to dictate most of the project. Ginsberg even modified the Uher by cutting the tape speed so he could fit more content on each reel of tape. It represents an early example of technologies from popular music influencing and prefiguring the composition of new poetry. And this led to Auto-Poesy. Auto-Poesy was Ginsberg's term for poetry he generated while in a vehicle, which he composed spontaneously, spoke out loud, and captured using a portable tape recorder. It blended subjective and objective aims and was descriptive and observational, but at the same time, it was infused with the poet's own thoughts and feelings, while the tape recorder enabled Ginsberg to embrace a more improvisational approach and allowed for composition without the use of a typewriter. Auto-Poesy was not purely spontaneous. Ginsberg transcribed his tape recordings into his notebooks and made extensive edits, breaking apart and all of the different spoken lines and sonic artifacts into an artificial poetic form. Auto-Poesy would become the primary form he used during the mid-60s to the mid-70s, specifically in Planet News and The Fall of America. And here's Ginsberg and Peter Orlovsky. This isn't Ginsberg's van, but you can get the idea of driving around in a Volkswagen camper for months on end. And lastly, in laying out the elements of Auto-Poesy, Ginsberg defined poetry as a composition of elements. Life itself is a composition of elements outside words. We don't think in dialectical, rigid patterns of quatrains or synthetic patterns of sonnets. Rigid forms in poetry could no longer be justified in his eyes. And just a little bit about the archival elements that I worked on as part of this project. One benefit of Ginsberg's Auto-Poesy is it's so well documented. The tapes themselves reside in Stanford University's Special Collections Library, along with the journals from the same time. And the tapes and the journals provide the researcher with a rich, unedited chronicle of his travels, poetic impulses, spiritual considerations while on the road. And I listened to some long tape-recorded drafts of a poem called Continuation of a Long Poem of the States, San Francisco Southward. And it becomes clear that Ginsberg wrote in sort of a spontaneous yet edited poetics. Here's the actual reel-to-reel tape and the library card describing the item. And this tape would then be transcribed in his journals, which were pretty much just a composition book. And then it would be edited and it would then appear in its final form. So here is a transcription that I did of the actual audio tape. We don't have time to listen today because it's like 4 hours long of him sitting in the car, talking into the microphone. But this is the monolithic wall of text that I extracted from the sound. And you can see, some of it is bolded, and that actually ended up in another version of the poem. Here we see the second stage. It's the reformulated snippets of the tape draft with entirely new lines. And you can see the total time to read this went from 12 minutes, 30 seconds in total to 2 minutes, 4 seconds. So this is his editorial mechanism at work. He has incorporated enjambment, line breaks. The line break signals his, a deliberate placing of an idea, a threshold where one part of an idea ends and another begins. And the broken line and broken syntax indicate hesitancies and interruptions. The conversation between all of the different line breaks and the surrounding white space results in an aesthetic that embodies the poem's intended effect. It's perpetual motion. It's sweeping from side to side, like driving across the country. And the arrangement of the lines on the page is spread out to be a rhythmic scoring of the accelerations, pauses, and trailings off, rather than thoughts as their verbal forms. And here is just a photo of one of Ginsberg's notebooks that I took. This isn't that same poem, but this is just to give you an idea of him finalizing his draft. And finally, through his drafting process, he would drastically alter the layout of the poem, and the resultant work would be considered a separate artifact from the tape-recorded draft. The tapes, which merge his subjective voice with the registrations of the exterior environment, offer a broader semantic field in which the poem is a single element in an extended array of sonic components. This merging of the empirical field recording with the subjective elements of editing is closer to what Ginsberg was thinking about when he developed Auto-Poesy, a non-dualistic enmeshing of subject and object. While the finished poem lacks the sense of totality, it prioritizes the voice of the poet over the sonic environment. And what the journal draft suggests is that the tape recorder is not the be-all, end-all improvisatory core of the Fall of America. It's an important tool, but a broader, complex part of the complex system of thought, transcription, and revision. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Michael. That was excellent. Excellent. We have time for some questions for Michael on his presentation. Does anyone have a question? You can just chime on in. You don't have to raise your hand. Okay, well, I'll ask a question. Hey, Michael, where was the archival work done? Was it done, well, I mean, tell us a little bit about where you found these materials.
Sure. So all of Ginsberg's personal archive resides at Stanford, and there's actually a funny story. He famously went to Columbia, and towards the end of his life, he began sort of, he kept everything in the Columbia archives, and he said, one day when I die, you can take it all. You can have this massive archive. And then towards the end of his life, he said, I need to cash out on this. So he took his offer around the country, and he got the highest cash offer for his archive, which was I think it was like $5 million or something, which for a poet is a lot of money. So he was able to sort of take care of his people and his family and his estate. And he donated his entire archive to Stanford University in, I think, 1993 or 4. And I met with one of the librarians there who met Ginsberg when he came and dropped off all this stuff. So he sort of knows this collection very well and worked on it for a long time. And I said, hey, I'm looking for something that is new and fresh. Everyone looks at Howl, everyone looks at Kaddish, everyone looks at the early career. And he said, you would not believe it, but there's this whole just ocean of audio recording. And then I started looking around at that time period. And then the beginning of my thesis actually coincided with the release of an edited set of Ginsberg's journals from this time. And I said, this is the perfect catalyst. And also, the Paris Review last summer released one of his Auto-Poesy poems that had never been published before, called Denver to Montana. It's really great, would recommend reading. And just recently in the New Yorker, another grad student here at Stanford wrote a great article all about Auto-Poesy and the audio recording technology. So it seems to be a hot topic these days.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, does anyone else have a question? We have a minute if someone has.
This is Kim. I was just going to add for Michael to look in the chat. There were a couple of comments, but I have to be sure to read April Ladinsky's. It said, idea for an after party, the 4-hour audio recording. So if people have a lot of time today and Michael's willing.
Yeah, well, the benefit is they're all available online. You can look up on the Stanford Library website and look up Ginsberg audio recording, though I must warn you, it can get a little self-indulgent, sitting through 12 hours of Allen Ginsberg talking about whatever he sees. After a while, it's kind of exhausting. But thanks everyone so much. Thanks, Kim, and thanks to the AGLSP for a great show.
Thank you very much.